It is a Tuesday afternoon, and I am sitting at my kitchen table holding a loan agreement for $180,000 that I never agreed to, staring at my own signature on the bottom of it, in my own handwriting that I did not write. I read contracts for a living. I have been a paralegal for 15 years. I have spent my whole career reading the fine print that everyone else skips, the clauses people sign without looking, the sentence on page 9 that changes everything on page 1. And I am telling you with total professional certainty that the signature on this document is mine, and that I never ever signed it. My husband did. He forged my name to borrow $180,000 against our home to fund a second life with a woman I am about to tell you all about. And he was careful. He got it notarized. He made it look perfect. He just forgot one single thing about the woman whose name he was forging. Reading the fine print is the one thing in this world I do better than almost anyone he has ever met. This is the story of the 10 days that turned my husband's perfect little forgery into the best piece of evidence I ever collected in my life. 10 days, one folder, and not a single raised voice. So let me start at the beginning. The afternoon the letter came, on an ordinary Tuesday, when I had no idea I was about to read the most important document of my life. But before I do, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. When you sign something, a loan, a lease, a contract, do you actually read it? All of it? The boring parts, the fine print, the back page? Be honest. Because most people don't, and the people who love you sometimes count on that. I read everything. And it is the entire reason this story ends with me keeping my home instead of losing it. Tell me in the comments, are you a reader or a signer? I read everyone. And I want to say one thing to the readers out there before the story really gets going. Because for years people made me feel like a nuisance for it. If you are the person who actually reads the lease, who asks the annoying question at the closing table, who makes everyone wait while you finish the last paragraph, you are not difficult. You are not paranoid. You are protected. The world is full of people who will count on your trust to mean you won't look. Keep looking. The 5 minutes of mild social awkwardness it costs you to read a document in front of someone impatient is nothing next to what it can save you. I learned that lesson over and over for other people in courtrooms. I just never imagined I'd have to learn it one Tuesday at my own kitchen table. Here is what you need to understand about me and my husband Derek. I am the careful one. Derek is the charming one. I read the documents, Derek handles the relationships. That was our division of labor for 9 years of marriage, and on paper it looked like balance. The house we lived in, I want you to remember, the house was bought largely with money I brought into the marriage, and it carried my name and my credit, because my credit was the good one. Derek's name was on it too, of course, but the foundation of it, financially and on paper, was mine, a fact that mattered far more than either of us understood on the day we signed. I had read every page of that mortgage the day we signed it. Derek had signed where I pointed. That was simply how we worked. I want to paint you a picture of how deep that habit went, because it matters. At my job, I am the person the attorneys hand a 40-page contract to and say, "Find the problem." And I find it, every time, because I was trained to assume the problem is always in the part no one wants to read. I read warranty cards. I read terms of service. My family teases me for it. Derek used to tease me for it. "Babe, just sign it. Nobody reads that," he'd say, and I'd read it anyway. And twice over the years, that habit caught something that saved us real money. Derek knew this about me. He had watched me do it for 9 years. So the truly stunning thing about what he did is not that he forged my signature. It is that he forged the signature of the one person on earth he had personally watched, read every document she ever touched, and somehow assumed she would never read this one. I have thought about that a lot. I think he had simply stopped seeing me. And a man who stops seeing the careful person in his life is a man who is about to get a very expensive reminder that she's still there. Day 1, the letter. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, from our mortgage bank addressed to both of us. Derek usually grabbed the mail, but he was traveling for work, and so I opened it. And it was a statement for a home equity line of credit. A second loan. Against our house. For $180,000. Opened 4 months earlier. Drawn down to almost nothing. I had never heard of it. I had never applied for it. And I am the person in this marriage who applies for things, because I am the person who reads what she's applying for. For a long moment, I actually doubted myself, which I think is worth admitting, because it's what these situations do to you. My first instinct wasn't Derek did this. My first instinct was, did I forget something? That is how trust works. It turns your suspicion inward before it ever points it where it belongs. I sat there and genuinely interrogated my own memory. Had I co-signed something during a stressful week, half asleep, and forgotten? But I knew better, because I don't sign things half asleep. I never have. That's the whole point of me. And the moment I let go of doubting myself and started trusting what I knew that I had never seen this document in my life, the entire picture snapped into focus, cold and clear. I want to tell you that my first reaction was panic. It wasn't. 15 years of reading documents does something to you. When something is very wrong on paper, you don't panic. You get precise. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I read every line of that statement, twice. And the floor went very quiet beneath me, not because I was falling, but because I had just realized I was standing on a crime scene, and I was the only one who could read it. 15 years of training, and it had all been quietly preparing me for this one document on this one Tuesday. Because there, in the loan file the bank had helpfully enclosed, was the application. And on the application was my signature, on every disclosure. On the page that legally required the signature of every person on the home's title. My signature, in my handwriting, and I knew, the way you know your own face, that I had not made a single one of those marks. So I did the single most important thing I did in this entire story. Nothing yet, I did not call Derek. I did not call the bank in a panic. Because the paralegal in me knew something the betrayed wife in me needed to hear, the second anyone knew I had found this, things would start to move, stories would get straight, documents would get explained, and a forgery that was sitting in plain sight would get muddied. Right now, Derek believed his secret loan was still secret, and that belief was the most valuable thing I owned. So I photographed every page. I noted the date the loan was signed, and I put the letter back in its envelope, and I made dinner, and I started, very quietly, to build a file which happens to be the thing I am best at in the entire world. That night, lying next to the empty side of the bed where Derek would have been if he weren't off working, I made myself a single promise, and it's the promise I'd give to anyone watching this who has just found their own version of that envelope. I promised myself I would not act out of pain. Pain makes you loud, and loud makes you sloppy, and sloppy loses cases. I would act out of preparation instead. I would gather, and read, and verify, and only when every page was where it needed to be would I say a single word. It is the hardest discipline in the world, to hold a truth that enormous in silence. But silence, when you are building, is not weakness. Silence is the sound of a case being made. Day 2. I read the fine print. All of it. And this is where being me started to matter. Because a normal person, finding a forged loan, knows one terrible thing. My husband stole money in my name. But I am not a normal person with a document. I read the whole file, every clause, every date. The way I read a file at work looking for the detail everyone else misses. And I found 3. The first detail, the signing date. The loan documents had been signed, in person, in front of a notary, on a specific Thursday 4 months earlier. And I knew exactly where I was that Thursday, because I am the kind of person who keeps a calendar like a courtroom record. I was 400 miles away, at a 2-day legal conference with a hotel folio, a flight record, and roughly 200 witnesses. I could prove, beyond any argument, that I was not in that notary's office signing anything. The forgery wasn't just a forgery. It was a forgery I could disprove on a calendar. If your heart is starting to pound the way mine did when I checked that date, do me one quick favor before I tell you about details 2 and 3. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, methodical revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage, and your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is about to sign something tonight without reading it. And believe me, the fine print is where this whole story turns. The second detail, the notarization. A notary had stamped and signed a statement swearing that I personally appeared before them on that Thursday. I did not, which meant either the notarization was fraudulent or someone had impersonated me in front of a notary. Either way, that stamp had just turned a private betrayal into something with a paper trail that pointed in a very specific, very serious direction and not at me. And the third detail, the one only a fine print reader would have caught. Buried in the home equity agreement was a clause about the underlying property, about how the line of credit related to the original mortgage and the title. And because I had read our original mortgage 9 years earlier, and remembered it, I understood something Derek clearly never had. The way our home's ownership and my separate contribution were documented gave me far more protection than he could possibly have realized. He had forged my name assuming we were 2 equal owners of a simple shared asset. The actual paperwork, the paperwork he never read, told a more complicated story, and every complication in it favored me. This is the part I wish I could put on a billboard for every person who has ever been told they're too much for caring about details. Derek operated on a vibe. He believed he understood our finances because he understood the feeling of our finances, that we were comfortable, that the house was ours, that things would split down the middle if it ever came to that. He had never once read the actual instruments that defined any of it. I had read all of them years ago, and more importantly, I remembered them, because reading without remembering is just looking. So while Derek was confidently forging his way into a future he'd imagined, I was holding the real architecture of our life in my head, the separate property trail, the way my contribution was documented, the specific language of the original mortgage. He'd built his whole crime on the cartoon version of our finances. I had the blueprints. Derek had spent his charm building a forgery. I spent one evening reading it, and found that he had built it on ground he didn't understand. Day 3 and 4. Where did the money go? This part was almost easy, because $180,000 does not evaporate quietly. I traced it the way I trace anything patiently, through statements, following each thread to its end. And the threads all led to the same place, a woman named Jenna. Of course there was a Jenna. There were the dinners and the trips, the ordinary furniture of an affair. But there was more. The loan had funded an apartment, leased in Derek's name, that I had never seen. It had funded what looked like the beginnings of a little business venture for Jenna. My husband had borrowed $180,000 against the house I built, forged my name to do it, and used it to set up a whole life for another woman, brick by brick, while I read bedtime stories and balanced our actual budget. The detail that stayed with me longest wasn't the apartment, or even the business venture. It was a single recurring transfer, modest, automatic, Set up to repeat, Derek had put Jenna's life on the same kind of careful monthly schedule he had never once applied to ours. He'd never set up an automatic anything for our household. I did all of that. But for her, he'd organized. He'd planned. He'd been, for her, the careful man he never bothered to be for me, except the carefulness was funded entirely by a crime committed against me. There's a special kind of clarity in that. It told me this wasn't a man who'd gotten lost. It was a man who had quietly decided I was the resource and she was the reward, and had been moving money from one to the other on a schedule. I sat with that for one evening. I let myself feel it, all the way down, exactly once. And then I closed the feeling like a file, and I opened the part of my brain that has won cases for other people for 15 years, and I went to work on my own. I called my sister that night, the only person I told while it was happening, and I didn't cry to her either. I said, I need you to know what's going on, and I need you to not tell me to confront him. And she, who knows me, said, You've already read it all, haven't you? You already know exactly what you're going to do. And I did. That's the strange gift of being the careful one in a crisis. While the betrayal is busy breaking your heart, the part of you that reads documents is already 3 steps ahead. Building the thing that will save you. I have comforted a lot of clients over 15 years who were drowning in paperwork they didn't understand. It turns out the discipline I'd built doing that for strangers was the exact discipline that kept me from drowning in my own. Day 5. The lawyer. I brought my file, the loan documents, the forged signatures, the conference records proving where I really was, the notary problem, the traced money, the photos. And I watched a senior attorney, a woman who has seen everything, go quiet as she read, which is how you know it's serious. And she told me 3 things. The first, forging a spouse's signature on a $180,000 loan and getting it notarized is not a marital squabble. It is fraud, and likely several other things with serious names. Most people, she said, come to me with a feeling and a suspicion. You came to me with a documented crime, dates, and an alibi. You didn't bring me a case. You brought me a closed one. I remember the exact moment she said it. Because I had spent 15 years on the other side of that desk, the paralegal who builds the file, hands it to the attorney, and watches them light up when the evidence is clean. I had never once been the client. And sitting in that chair, hearing a senior attorney tell me my own file was airtight, was the strangest mix of grief and pride I have ever felt. Grief, because it was my marriage in that folder. Pride, because some stubborn, careful part of me had spent my whole career rehearsing for a disaster I prayed would never come, and when it came, that part of me did not flinch. It just got to work. The second, because I could prove I never signed the conference, the travel records, the timeline the loan was very likely unenforceable against me, and the fraud was Derek's alone to answer for. The debt he'd built to fund his new life was, increasingly, going to belong only to him. And the documented way my home was protected meant the house he'd borrowed against was far more mine than he'd assumed. And the third thing she told me, quietly, setting down the pages. She said, You have something almost no one in your position has. You have proof, and you have leverage, and you have not tipped your hand. So you don't have to fight him. You get to give him a choice and make sure every version of that choice ends with you whole. Day 6 through 9. Getting everything in place. So I did what I do. Quietly, while Derek was still traveling for work, I made certified copies of everything. I moved my own separate finances fully into my own name. I had the forgery and the notarization formally documented. My lawyer prepared 2 things. A divorce filing and a clear, devastating accounting of the fraud, every forged page, every date, the alibi, the traced money. We were meticulous about one thing above all. I never did anything I wasn't entitled to do. I never moved a dollar that wasn't mine. I never touched his private accounts, never broke into anything, never forged anything. In return, the irony of out-forging a forger would have been the one thing that could sink me. And I knew it. Everything in my file came from documents I had every right to hold. The bank's own letter, addressed to me. My own calendar and travel records. The public facts of the loan. The money traced through accounts that were half mine. I stayed exactly, scrupulously within my rights, because the whole power of my position came from being the clean one in a story about a crime. The careful habit that exposed the fraud was the same habit that kept my own hand spotless while I used it. And the entire time, when Derek called to say goodnight from wherever he really was, I asked about his trip and told him to travel safe and watched him relax into the belief that his careful wife had, for once in her life, not read something. There was one bad moment, on day 8, when he nearly caught it. He came home a day early, and the certified copies were still spread across the dining table where I'd been organizing them. I heard his car in the driveway, and I had maybe 20 seconds. I gathered the pages into a folder, slid it into my work bag, the one place Derek would never look, because he had never once been interested in my work, and met him at the door with a smile and a "you're early." He kissed my cheek and asked what I'd been up to. I said I'd brought some files home from the office, which was true in the most useful possible way. He didn't give it a second thought. The man who'd forgotten I read the fine print had also forgotten that a paralegal's work bag is the safest vault in the house. He'd spent 9 years finding my job boring. That boredom is exactly what hid the evidence that ended our marriage. Day 10. The reveal. Derek came home on a Friday, relaxed, tanned, telling me about his exhausting work trip. I made dinner. I let him eat. And then I slid a folder across the table. On top was the home equity loan agreement. I watched him recognize it. I watched the color leave his face. Underneath it was the forged signature page, beside a copy of my conference badge and travel records from that exact Thursday, the proof, in 2 pages, that the signature was a lie. Underneath that was the trail of the money, ending at Jenna's apartment. And underneath all of it was the divorce filing and a single page from my lawyer laying out, in plain language, exactly what forging a spouse's name on a notarized 6-figure loan can mean. Derek, the charming one, looked at a file built by the careful one, and for the first time in 9 years, he had absolutely nothing charming to say. He went through the usual stages, and quickly, because the documents left him nowhere to stand. First came the denial there had to be a mistake. The bank had mixed something up. Surely I didn't think he'd actually. And then his eyes landed on the conference badge clipped to my travel records, dated the same Thursday as his notarized signing, and the sentence died in his mouth. Then, the anger, how could I go behind his back and pull all this? As if reading the mail and checking my own calendar were the betrayal. And then, fastest of all, the bargaining. Couldn't we work this out privately? Did we really need to make it official? Think of what it would do to him. To him. Even then. I almost pointed out that think of what this will do to me had clearly never crossed his mind on the Thursday he forged my name. But I didn't, because I had stopped needing him to understand anything. The folder understood. The law understood. That was enough. He started to explain. I held up my hand, the same hand whose signature he'd faked, and I said the only sentence I had prepared. I said, "Derek, you spent 15 years watching me read every word of every contract in this house. You really should have remembered that before you signed my name to one." And I let the folder say the rest. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice when I told him his choices. Sign the divorce as my lawyer had drafted it, leaving with the debt he'd forged and none of my home, or explain the notarized forgery to people whose job it is to ask about notarized forgeries. He understood. A man who builds a careful crime understands, better than anyone, when he's been caught by someone more careful. He held out for exactly 3 days. He called twice, trying the charm one more time, the warm voice that had worked on everyone for as long as I had known him. It didn't work, because charm is an argument aimed at the feelings. And I had stopped answering with my feelings and started answering with paper. On the 3rd day, his lawyer called mine, and he signed. The divorce was clean, because the fraud made it clean. The forged loan became his to answer for, not mine, because I could prove I never signed it. I kept my home the one he'd borrowed against without me, because the fine print he never read protected the woman who always did. Jenna, I heard, did not stay long once the funded apartment and the funded little business turned out to be funded by a crime attached to a man now drowning in it. There's no romance in $180,000 of someone else's fraud. The months after were quieter than I expected, and better. The thing nobody tells you about being the careful one is how much energy it takes to be careful for 2 people, one of whom is actively working against you. When that weight lifted, I felt almost weightless. I read my own documents now for my own life, and there is a deep, specific peace in knowing that every page with my name on it is a page I actually put it there. I kept the house. I kept my work. The work he found so boring it became my hiding place and my salvation. And I kept the habit, the reading, the checking, the refusal to sign what I haven't understood not as armor anymore, but just as who I am, finally valued at full price. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who got revenge, but as someone who was nearly robbed in her own name by the person who promised to protect her, it's this. Read what you sign. Read all of it. The boring parts, the back page, the clause, on page 9. Know your own documents better than anyone else in your life knows them, not because you're suspicious, but because they are yours, and your name is yours, and no one should be able to use it while you look away. Being the careful one is not the boring trait people make it out to be. One day, it may be the only thing standing between you and losing everything. The people who truly love you will never need you to stop reading. Only the ones with something to hide ever do. So read on. Read the lease, the loan, the prenup, the policy, the terms. Read the page everyone tells you to skip. Your name is the most valuable thing you own, and a signature is a key to your whole life. Never let anyone borrow that key by counting on you to look away, and never, ever apologize for being the one who reads. There's one more thing, though. A few weeks after the divorce was final, the notary from that Thursday reached out to me frightened, wanting to explain how Derek had gotten that stamp in the first place and what he'd been told. What that notary said, and what it revealed about how long Derek had really been planning all of this, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.